Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, thank you very much for coming to my Atharamadiyawa channel in my resistance program, the mini series, because I wanted very much for someone to conceptualize this concept of dissent. And what I have been doing in this series was talk to many artists who were involved in protesting through their art. And the different genres were represented, and it's still going on. There was dance, there was drama, there is music, it's going to be painting, and film. And what united all of them was the fact that they needed to protest, and most of them were connected to the ongoing protest in Sri Lanka. And I wanted an academic who has done writing about this dissent as a concept. And I came across a very recent book of yours, The Intimacy of Dissent, which I think you have the book. I just have the, because it's an open access book, I just have the printouts. This book in which you have, I guess, broken down many preconceived notions of dissent, broken away from considering the personal life of a dissenter and dissent. Very often those are juxtaposed as being opposing forces. But you and the other four writers, and I think the most well-known is Professor Jonathan Spencer, you have said that not really. The intimate life is very much part of dissent. Sometimes, yes, the pulling is on the opposite side. And an example you had given from Joe Senaviratna's life is he had to either file a report or take his son to hospital. And then the comrades are very angry that he even thought of helping the wife and the son. Now that's an opposing force. But you have also said sometimes they actually enable dissent. You dissent for someone, for the sake of someone else. And you've shown the complexity of the situation, right? Before I get into this book, Harini, is it possible for you to tell how you got to this academic level? You are known as a social anthropologist, right? Let's see what was your first degree? Where was it from? Harini, you're muted.
Yeah, my first degree was in sociology from the University of Delhi. Then my master's was from Macquarie in Australia in applied anthropology. And then my PhD was in Edinburgh in social anthropology. I took long breaks in between, so I did my first degree. I completed in 1993, and my PhD I finished in 2010. So it was really spread out quite a bit.
You are talking to someone who got the PhD at 52, Harini. So yes, I quite get that. Also, what was your trajectory after the PhD? Did you suddenly were you becoming an academic, or were you having any idea of doing other things? What was your path to? I knew you first as a lecturer in the Open University. What was your path there?
Well, actually, soon after my first degree, I started working in the psychosocial sector. So for about 10, 12 years, I've worked primarily in the field of mental health and psychosocial work.
What exactly is psychosocial, Harini?
So psychosocial work is a kind of the intersection between psychology and sociology, I would say. So where psychology takes a conventional psychology, and the very Western models of psychology tend to locate all sort of a sense of mental health and well-being within an individual. The psychosocial approach also situates a person within a social, cultural, political context, right? And looks at the impact that all those other factors and all those other sectors have on individual well-being, and the link between the individual and society. So it's a kind of a move away from a very biomedical model of mental health to a much more broader, holistic approach to well-being. So I worked.
No link to counseling or anything, right?
can include counseling, but that's only one of the many kinds of interventions that you can have in the psychosocial sector. So it's actually a critique. It developed from a critique of of the biomedical model of mental health to a more socially and culturally situated approach to understanding mental health. So the interventions can vary from individual therapy to community, to economic interventions, to community-based mental health work. So it's very broad. It can be, the types of interventions are very diverse in the field.
What was your PhD on?
So my PhD actually developed as a result of my own frustration with the development and humanitarian sector. I had worked in it for several years and was increasingly frustrated in Sri Lanka, increasingly sort of frustrated with what was seen to be the gap between policy and practice, and the sort of ways in which all our sort of noble ideas about doing good kind of got stuck when it actually came to implementation and to doing things on the ground. And I wanted some time off from the sector to really think about it and write about this stuff. And a PhD seemed an ideal way to do that, to reflect on this field and to sort of work out some of the frustrations that I was also feeling in the field. So I chose to do my fieldwork in the Department of Probation and Childcare Services, where I looked at how frontline workers translated or interpreted policies that they are, subject to, in terms of how they translated those into services and into actions and interventions, and how that impacted on those receiving those services. So I was interested in looking at that process of policy formulation to actual service delivery, and the different ways in which people were involved in that process, and the ways in which policy gets implemented and interpreted by different groups of people within that whole sort of process.
Listening to you, of course, I'm thinking, you don't have to answer this, but probably the biggest obstacle between policy and practice must be political interference. So seeing how things are happening in Sri Lanka right now, but you don't have to answer that. Harini, so your lecturership was after quite a gap from getting your degree, right?
No, I completed my PhD in 2010, I think, and 2011 I started working at the Open University. Before that, I had worked briefly as a temporary lecturer there, and before that, I had also worked at the University of Colombo for a short time, not as a lecturer, but as a researcher attached to the Social Policy Analysis Research Center, which was in
so
the
degree that the degree that you got in Australia is actually that subject discipline is available here?
Applied anthropology, I'm not sure.
The psychosocial.
Psychosocial, there is a degree in counseling and psychosocial work. I was part of that teaching faculty till quite recently from the University of Colombo, FGS at University of Colombo. They offer a master's program in counseling and psychosocial work.
Anyone can apply?
Anyone can apply. At least when I was on the faculty, the main criteria that we looked at for selection was interest in working in this field, or people who are already working in this field. But we had a really diverse bunch of students, medical doctors to teachers to counselors to various sort of people with very, very different backgrounds, also from the military.
Okay. Harini, so this book on dissent, and I've been reading some other things about what you've written it. What made you kind of focus on this aspect, resistance, dissent, discipline, and I've read some other things you have written. What made you focus on dissent as a interesting subject?
So this book came out of a larger project, which was titled the Anthropology of Conscience, where it was a multi-country study involving the UK, the former USSR, and Sri Lanka. So the UK part of the study looked at conscientious objectors post-World War II. The USSR part of the study, the Soviet part of the study, looked at Soviet dissidents, particularly in the 70s and 80s. And our part of the study, the Sri Lankan part of the study, that was conducted by myself, Jonathan Spencer, and Siddhartha Maunaguru, looked at the period from about the 1960s to 2004 or so in Sri Lanka, which is often sort of defined as a period where sort of the mainly understood in terms of the LTT, the activities of the LTT, and in the north and east, and the JVP in the south. But we wanted to look at sort of the in-between space here as well, because our sort of informal observations of that period was that it was far more complex than just about the LTT in the north and the JVP in the south, that it was a period of intense activism and of multiple sort of groups that were functioning at that time. And we wanted to bring that out because that's something that's not talked about much. You know, when we refer to that period in Sri Lanka, especially in the social sciences, we felt it was overdefined by either the LTTE or the JVP. And we wanted to look at all the other stuff that was going on.
If I might interrupt, I think you have used her name, Veena Das, in the introduction, where she says history, mainstream history, forgets the smaller stories. And if you were to concentrate on, you know, survival stories or small individual stories, it might tell a different tale other than what the meta-history or the meta-narrative of history tells us. And I think that's exactly what you have done here, Harini, in your chapter on Joe Senaviratne, where you concentrate on one activist and you tell his story. So was it a conscious decision to look at the smaller stories, which won't put what happened during that time either as JVP or LTTE, which are huge meta-narratives? And we tend to look at our past within those two trajectories of two movements. But there were so many intermediary stories. Was it a conscious decision to look at that intermediate space that made you pick someone like Joe?
Yeah, well, it was a conscious decision to interview Joe for sure, but we were looking at people who had, when we started out, we wanted to talk to people who had not joined either the JVP or the LTT, which seemed like the obvious things to do, right? If someone was a political dissident at that time, if someone was opposing the state at that time and critical of the state, the obvious two places seemed to be the LTT or the JVP. But there were also a whole host of others who were also fighting the state, who were critical of the state, who were dissidents, but who didn't fall into either one of those camps. And we wanted to talk to those people. So it was in that process that we came across, in many of our interviews, we came across this organization, MERGE, Movement for Interracial Justice and Equality, that was started by Father Paul Kaspers, a Jesuit, a priest. And Joe Senaviratne was its first coordinator, first national organizer. And his name kept coming up in several of the interviews that we did. MERGE kept coming up with several people that we spoke to. And so he was one of the people that then I tracked down and interviewed for this study.
Harini, now the small stories, the reason, and another chapter, because Siddhartha Maunaguru isn't here, he also does it, and he does it from a context which I am not familiar with, and most people from the South, the Sinhala people, might not be familiar with. And he actually opened my eyes to this facet that we really forget in that small community that Jaffna was. How many differing groups existed before LTT became the main group, and that also through violence of just silencing through violence, dissident voices, and how much, how close-knit they would have been before they got ideologically separated. They probably would have gone to the same school, would have been neighbors, would have been their own friends who found themselves in ideological groups, and where dissent would have meant murder or death. And this Managuru's chapter, where he talks to one person who managed to, because he did not like silencing and he kept on saying this is wrong, his life came under threat and he went to the West. And how nevertheless, whenever somebody, and he came there, he used to help them find jobs or place to sleep, forgetting the ideological differences, and how friendship cut across ideology in that sense. So those small stories, and I was struck by the fact, maybe this wasn't the point of the article, but I was struck by the fact that how little we think of how friendship would have intersected with, loyalty and betrayal and being a traitor within the Jaffna community, because there were so many groups and so many that had to be silenced, and it would have been among very few. No? So did that surprise you as well, this kind of?
Well, the number of groups certainly surprised me, and I still struggle to keep track of this, how, who merged into whom and which group splintered from which group, and how that all happened, because I think there were so many, and a similar story in the South as well, right? So many different groups that at one point worked together, at one point separated, at one time became bitter enemies, but like you said, were also caught up in this sort of real network of sociality, where it was impossible to escape from each other also, as it were. And I think what Siddharthan is trying to show in his chapter also is how those kinds of ideas of friend, traitor are very murky and very, can flow into one another and are not as distinct as one would imagine, right?
By saying that, are you flying against the accepted theories of dissent, like you mentioned Smith? Do they normally consider the friendship and enemy as to separate things? And the point of this book is to say, not really. It can overlap in very unseen ways.
Well, Schmidt defines politics as the way in which you sort of identify your friend and your enemy, right? And that's sort of the kind of the more mainstream or the traditional understanding of politics, right? As adversarial, as one where there's no place for emotion, there's no place for blurring of any of these categories, and actually, and it's very individual based, right? It's an ethical, moral position. Conscience itself is seen as something very individual. Dissent is seen as something very individual. What we're trying to do in this book and in the bigger project is actually to highlight the fact that this is not just individual actions. These are embedded in a very dense and complex system of social relations that both nurtured what they did, could at times were constraints, and that these networks went often beyond sort of kinship structures, and where sort of some of the distinctions that are made in politics between friend and enemy, between traitor and comrade, become very blurry. And more than anything, how the sort of how emotional some of these things were. These are not sort of just sort of calculated technical decisions and choices that people make, but highly charged emotional sort of. I mean, they're made in a very emotional context as well. This is as much about friendships and sort of things that bind us together, and things that also separate us, but also very, very emotionally, right?
And
That's what
I
we
think,
wanted to talk about.
right, and the mentioning of the South, we mustn't forget that, when there was a lot of silencing of dissent, and Jose Naviratna's case is a case in point, where his criticism wasn't always accepted well, and he was actually put out of particular groups. So this kind of opposition to dissent has marked many movements, which may have led to their eventual collapse. At some point, people don't take dissent very well, either in Sri Lanka or say in Soviet Russia or any place. So the danger of dissent, it's very clear. And what you have done here is also show that it's not easily definable, because what is dissent in one context can easily not be so when the context changes, or depending on who looks at it, and it's not always positive either. So these various, the definitions, how would you talk about that, whether we can define dissent as being one thing?
Well, that's, I think, what we are also trying to say, that it's difficult to pin it down as one thing and not another. We didn't want to also romanticize the idea of dissent. Dissent is not always on the side of progressive causes. And also some of these characters, almost all of these characters we interviewed, were extremely difficult people to live with, right? I mean, that their personalities were such that they were not easy people. They were certainly not your average kind of conciliatory people. They had strong opinions, strong views of how things should be, and so dissent can in itself be very uncomfortable, right, for yourself and for people around you.
Also
So
dangerous, I think, like what we see now, right now in the Aragale.
yeah,
There are people now locked up, and their children might be parading in protest.
yeah.
So, Harini, something that really interested me was you said what we normally take as dissent is a very liberal kind of outlook. It's tied to the conscience of an individual, but that necessarily doesn't have to be the case.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like a community decision, which is dissent.
Mm.
Could you speak about the example that's given here about the Orthodox Jewish women?
Yeah, so that chapter by, I forget the name of the author, that chapter on Orthodox, sorry, let me just remind myself again about that Erica Weiss's chapter
Yeah.
on Orthodox Jews.
Yes.
Women. I mean, that really shows how the positions that that community took with regard to expressing their dissent was something that was negotiated and negotiated within a group. It was not just an individual position that was taken, right? It was a negotiation from a collective point of view, and that position of dissent, that stance, was a stance that was taken as a collective. So it's that's what one of the things we wanted to show, because like sort of conventional literature tends to talk about dissent and conscience as something that's an individual stance, as an individual point, a position that's taken. And here what we're stressing over and over again is how deeply embedded these positions are in social relations,
And maybe particular communities, particular religions, and it's very similar to something a particular group, ethnic group in Sri Lanka also has. This big probably community, which we don't quite consider within the same framework that we might consider individual dissent to be. And another collective that I see is right now, what's happening outside. It seems very a collective way of dissenting. Harini, the links that are generally considered opposing factors, And you have beautifully put it that sometimes personal factors can be the enablers of dissent as well. And the example that you start this chapter with is of a Russian woman who goes to protest against the state, and she carries her baby with her very young son. And immediately as I read it, I thought, like, this is something we see right now, where mothers, either pregnant mothers with with the baby, at the very famous iconic picture of the very first protest at Mirihana, where the mother carried the baby and had her fist up. That became iconic, right? We also had seen mothers carrying their babies, but in Russia, they actually got her to the police station, they interviewed her, and there was a lot of, the example is how her personal life was affected by the act of protest. And she was finally put into a psychiatric ward because they framed it within her being mentally unbalanced. So how different social dynamics can be used against dissenters, right? And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could see that happening here as well. I think when I mean, I've seen chatter on social media criticizing the choices those women made to take their children, saying you put your child in danger, right? So it in some ways it contradicts with notions of motherhood, of safety, of the mother's responsibility, right? And these women are in a way defying some of those conventions and defying those sort of notions of a good mother, right? And we're getting a lot of flack for it, right?
they are running against culture also.
Yeah, they are taking a different position, right? And the counter argument was that the they also made those decisions based on certain calculations and certain judgments, and they should be allowed to do that, right? So you can see that these in very often that these acts of dissent fly against what is accepted, what is, I mean, that is what dissent does, right? It upsets a convention. It makes others around you uncomfortable. That you're doing it. But dissent is that's the point that we wanted to make also, that dissent comes from a strong position that you're taking in terms of your sort of moral and ethical position as well. But our argument was that moral and ethical position is not purely an individual choice or an individual impulse. That moral and ethical decision or choice that you're making is embedded in a web, a very complex and strong web of social relations and emotions.
And the critique would also come within that context, of the cultural, social thing we look at. Nevertheless, dissent would also always require courage, right, Harini, for the same reason?
Oh, yeah, because very often these people are putting themselves in danger, physical danger. Almost all the people that we write about, risk their lives, right? So it takes an immense amount of courage to do that. But once again, I mean, that was what was interesting, that many of these people told us these stories not in terms of personal acts of courage, right? But sort of in terms of how they came to be in those situations through the networks that they were in, right? Through collective decisions, of course, the desire to change things, the desire to challenge things, and their critique of something they were fighting against. But it was not just individual choices, like, for instance, when Joe was in prison and when, they did four others with him in prison. And when he had to, when they took, you had two queues, one for the food and one to get the water. You couldn't do both. And Joe would choose to go to the food queue so that the others could go have their bath. So, and which often meant that he didn't get enough food because the others had gobbled up all the food by the time he had his bath. But you continue to do that because, that's what you do. That's what being a comrade means. That's what.
And I think a textbook case right now is what we see at Golface, Harini, because for the longest time, they did not say it's being led by anyone. They just kept it nameless.
Yeah.
So every time I read this, I'm like, you're actually seeing a textbook case here. And they made sure it's a collective. That was.
Yeah. No, I found, yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I found it fascinating how that sort of came about in that space. This, because in a way, this period, if you sort of look at it, especially young people during this time, are often seen to be very individualistic, right? Very selfish even, right? And yet, I think this whole Aragalaya experience was all about the collective, was all about solidarity building, was all about support and network.
And very much friendship based and,
Very much friendship based. And in a way, the attack on the Aragalaya is, for me, an attack on those values. It's to push against that and to say, go back to being atomized individuals. Don't do this. Don't come together, right? You can't come together. So creating that conflict, putting in the violence there.
And what followed the violence was also quite stunning to see, actually. People just running to help utter strangers.
Yeah.
And for a moment, what happened afterwards, we don't even know what on earth happened afterwards with, the protracted violence everywhere. But that moment in Golface of being attacked, and they stood together. Nobody just stood together, they got hit together, and us people around just ran to their help. So it was a very odd, strange moment of putting what you're saying into actual visual form, Harini. It was incredible how textbook that seemed. And the end of that, no one actually knows, but we do. We, at least from the place we stand now, we saw a moment where the young Sri Lankan people took a stand and took it together, maintained by, and everything you say we saw in action. What a cost it was for personal life, how intimacy helped power it, right? And it's quite unexpected. Is such things quite common in the world, you think, Harini? This kind of stand the young people are taking now? Did it happen in Russia for Tiananmen Square? Did it happen in China?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's common, but there are lots of examples of it throughout human history, I think. And I think in a way that's something that we need to remember, because we are often told that as humans, our impulse is not to be that, not to form bonds of solidarity, not to think of each other, not, that our natural state of being is to be selfish, right? And to be competitive. And yet, I think in human history, there are examples over and over again where we've demonstrated that that is not so, right? That human beings
even Sri Lanka has many examples of
both applies. We can be as driven by sort of collective, unselfish sort of feelings of solidarity as much as we can be by selfishness, right? And those are choices we make, right? And I think that's what's so important for us to hold on to even in this moment, however much we are told that this is not how we are supposed to be. I think at the end of the day, that human impulse that brings us together, and the fact that sort of relationships are fundamentally important for our survival keeps coming through, right? And I think that's what's happening now also.
I would, since I don't want to talk very much about this, I wish, Harini, there was a book in Sinhala that is similar to this kind of stuff you're writing. Is there anything in Sinhala that people can read?
I have not seen very many. I mean, there are lots of autobiographies and biographies of people, of course, right, who've been part of political movements, who've been dissidents. One book that's not directly connected to this is an edited volume by Professor Nirmal Ranjit Devasiri on the kinds of writings and publications that covered this almost the exact same period that we refer to in this book. And that's in Sinhala. And in a way, his introduction and also his sort of editorial comments in that, there are 2 volumes there, show what a vibrant and complex period that was, and the kinds of intellectual debates and the ideas that were discussed and debated at length in great intensity are sort of shown in that book. So that's one. I mean, that's not directly about what we're talking today, but it has a link. It shows the kind of intensity of feelings and the intensity of ideas that were present.
Yeah. It's a very handsome set of books. I have that, I think, published by Vidarshana. If people can get their hands on that. So Harini, what I would want to say is thank you for pointing out the importance of little stories, the stories that fall through the cracks of the main blocks of attention or the focus, so to say, because that is where, looking back, you know, we have both lived through these times, but for a young person looking back, those are unheard stories. They may not know even that they existed, that there were a lot of in-between people. And you hear the meta stories. And with things like this, where you analyze dissent, and Siddhartha and Manuguru showing that friendship finally overcame ideological differences also, when they were trying to survive in another country. You know, stories like that may give a different narrative to the narrative we are used to seeing as history in this country. And the conceptualization of dissent, that it's not easy.
Yeah.
It's not, sorry.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say that even the meta-narratives are not as clear-cut as they are presented to us, right? That those are also equally complex stories, which, you know, where with a lot of, again, a lot of heartache, a lot of emotion, a lot of dissent even within, right? So none of these stories are sort of as simplistic or as definable as the meta-narrative would have us believe.
Have us believe, yes.
That's the point.
And bringing out stories like this is to, in a way, resist that.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a good book. It's available online and it's free. If you can download, it's open access. And so Harini, let me thank you for coming and, you know, talking about the academic writing you have done. I didn't ask you this in the Sinhala interview. Harini, what are the books or other writing that you have done?
We are working on another book, Jonathan, Siddhartha and I, which is focusing specifically on the Sri Lankan part of the story. So that's the other book. I'm hoping to also put out my PhD thesis finally, many years later. But yeah, I'm
that's
finding
tough because things could have changed, right? If it was
the fieldwork situation has, but I think my main argument still holds. So I felt that I needed to put that out. Finding less and less time for writing now, which is a bit unfortunate. So it's taking time, but yeah.
I would really like the fact that, you know, Jonathan's PhD is quite famous, right? A quick introduction to the two of them before we start.
Yeah, so Jonathan Spencer, who did his fieldwork here, he's also an anthropologist.
Studying Sri Lanka for decades.
Yeah, since the 1980s. So he's very closely linked to Sri Lanka. His research is based in Sri Lanka. His first book was the Sinhala Village in a Time of Trouble, which was based on his doctoral research. He has supervised many students in Sri Lankan students as well as students of Sri Lanka.
And he was your teacher as well, right?
He was my supervisor as well. Siddharthan is currently at the National University of Singapore. His PhD was in the US at Johns Hopkins, and his supervisor was Veena Das, and Jonathan was also on his committee. And Siddharthan also spent some time during his doctoral writing up stage. We both were in Edinburgh together at the same time, which is also how some of the work that we are doing currently kind of has come about, also because of our stay in Edinburgh together.
It's always heartening to have academics working at, serious levels at international forums. And as much as I honor that, I wish more translations also came, Harini, to Sinhala and Tamil. I really, really wish for that. But then, a lot of things have to change here. Yeah, we have institutions.
We are actually quite keen that the book that we are currently working on, which is specifically on Sri Lanka, gets translated. We first have to finish the book before we can think of the translations. Yeah. We also hope that it will be open access, or at least that we can have a South Asian version, which will make it more accessible.
Absolutely, because the cost can also be
prohibitive. Yeah,
I'm learning these days. So let's hope, but at least getting it out there is the first step.
Yeah,
it's better to have something out there and then work towards how it can be made affordable. So Harini, thank you for being the academic you are. You keep on researching and putting out things which are necessary to be documented. And also thank you for coming. Thank you for doing the interview in both languages, because
thank you for having me.
Apart from all this, Harini, I'm also trying to be an English teacher and get people to listen to both languages. So it's very important that we spoke in both languages. And I hope those who can access the original in English, read this. And let's hope, Harini, that even this short discussion on dissent, made the complexity of the situation clear to those who listen to us. So thank you very much again for your time.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for the work that you are doing, not only in bringing these books to local audiences, but for language, which I think is invaluable.
Thank you very much. Okay.